Hello, welcome to this Farm Advisory Service video. Today we are talking what we termed alternative forages, but really we're talking about diverse mixes that we may consider to complement the ryegrass and clover pasture to improve our resilience to our changing climate. So with changing climate there comes challenges and potentially opportunities. Weather is perhaps becoming a bit more extreme. And also we might be able to grow species in areas where we weren't able to grow before. So there are opportunities to change the species that we sow in light of these changing conditions. I'm joined here today by William Fleming of Germinal Seeds. William covers a lot of Scotland and into Northern England and has seen changing sort of patterns in seed demand. Could you comment on what you've seen over the last sort of 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, in the last 5 years we have moved away from being solely perennial ryegrass and white clover to now we're seeing a huge increase, probably an exponential increase in the amount of red clover, if we can get enough red clover seed, and also the herbs. And the herbs I mean the large predominant herbs being chicory and plantain. The growth and the usage of them has been phenomenal in this last 5 years. And they're just adding something and adding resilience to forage production, and they're also helping to buffer out these dry periods that we're having across the seasons as we're moving forward now. And
of course these have sort of different feed value. Some of them are picking up perhaps more minerals. We talked a bit about how legumes have got greater protein and feed value. So there are the benefits in producing forage more resiliently, but also improving animal performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that sticks out, the two that stick out really are chicory and also red clover, because with chicory that's got a really deep taproot, so it's bringing up moisture, but it's also bringing up minerals from further down in the soil profile. So it's changing that mineral balance in the sward and what the livestock are eating, and it's also seems to balance the amino acid content, seems to balance really well with the protein in the grass, and stock do really well on it. And anecdotally, there's also the anthelmintic properties that it appears to have. The work that you mentioned earlier with Tommy Boland at UCD in Dublin, they reduced the wormers by half when they included some of these multi-species swards into the grazing for their ewes and lambs.
Yeah. So you mentioned multi-species swards, including a range of these herbs and legumes alongside the grasses. What have you observed to work well in Scotland and what less well?
This is a very general comment. I think from a multi-species perspective, when we look at the herb and legume element of it, as long as we stick to the major legumes and herbs, and by that I mean red and white clover as the legumes and chicory and plantain and the herbs, then they are consistent and will perform across a huge variety. Practically all of the land types that we're farming in Scotland, they will work on them. The challenges is when you move to some of the smaller herbs and legumes. I hate to say secondary, but they are smaller. They are very site specific in terms of whether it's dry land, they need like say yarrows and burnets, don't like these waterlogged soils. You really start to struggle, and the other element with them is they don't produce the same kilograms of dry matter per hectare that you get from the major species, your red and white clovers and your chicories and your plantains. And at the end of the day, we're here to feed livestock, so we need kilos of dry matter. So sticking to the main ones, unless you have a very specific requirement on your farm, is the safest option.
Perhaps we talk less about the different options with the grasses themselves. So we're talking, the grass component, grass, legume, herbs. But again, what opportunities are there in grasses to improve the resilience to like drought conditions?
We're never going to go away at the moment from high quality perennial ryegrasses. They're still going to be the backbone of what we do. As a company, we are doing a lot of trial work at our site in Wiltshire. And what we see there is that when we have a mix with 5 species of grass in it, what we find when we do that is that these multi-grass, multi-species swards are actually producing more kilos of dry matter than a monoculture of perennial ryegrass under a low input system. And it's because of the way the different grass species grow at different times of the year. They're not only competing with one another, but they're complementary to one another. So we're kind of levelling out the production over the course of the season, and that is having a big impact on forage availability. But the backbone still is to keep a good proportion of good quality perennial ryegrasses in it, because for probably 44, 46 weeks of the year, when those are the species that's going to produce the kilos of dry matter, it's only when we get into these dry periods that the other grasses really come into their own to try and help compensate for the ryegrasses tailing off in their production. And it all depends on when we hit these dry periods in the year.
I'm just thinking back when I sort of started my career, perhaps sort of 10 years ago, people were advocating for small range of heading dates in grasses. And I was just wondering with that, and because that's beneficial to silage quality, with that range that you're trialling in Wiltshire, would that be disadvantage the sort of silage cutting dates, or would that be purely for grazing sort of situations?
How long's a piece of string in that one, Poppy? Because for the tight heading date range, when you're producing high quality silage, either for dairy cows or for growing stock that you're trying to push on and get high live weight gains with, you're maximising your energy production by having that tight heading date range and maximising the quality that you've got there, which is really important for those systems. On systems where that sort of live weight or gain is not so crucial, then some of these multi-grass type swards can then come into their own and be beneficial, because the quality isn't the major element of what you're trying to do. You're trying to get bulk, but it's horses for courses. I hate to be cliched, but really you have to think about what you're trying to do. And I think a comment I would make when we're talking about that is multi-species swards are a great addition to a grazing platform, but because of the challenges that we've discussed earlier about management of them, I wouldn't put them across the whole platform. They're to be used judiciously.
So back to the herbs, so we're talking chicory and plantain. We were going around the farm earlier, and seeing these herbs in the fields after 3 years is actually perhaps coming to the limit for some of these sites in Scotland. Is that, do we sort of handle that level of persistency, or is there anything we can do to improve the persistency of these herbs?
I think that tends to be the limit to the persistency of them. Management has an impact on it, but also the conditions where they've been grown has an impact. So anywhere between kind of 3 to 4 years is the average that we would see these herbs persisting. The challenge is that we're only really including them back into mixes now. 50, 60 years ago they were all in the mixes, but we haven't done the breeding on those herbs that we've done in the last 50 or 60 years that we've done on ryegrasses, on clovers. So we don't have that same persistency and purity, and we haven't bred in the persistency yet. So I know there are breeding programs started on plantains and chicories, but when you walk across supposedly a space plant nursery and they're supposedly all the same variety, the variation across the plants is huge. So it just goes to show that we haven't bred, or there hasn't been the breeding done on these species to get the consistency yet, and that's going to be a long-term project going forward. Yeah. It's going to take time.
Yeah. But from the farmer's perspective, there's a lot they can do to stack the odds in their favour in terms of grazing management. I know a lot of the time we say increase the rest period. If you're rotationally grazing, you might rest them for about 30 days rather than 20, 21 days over the summer months. And you might not graze them as tight to maintain plantain and the chicory. So sort of out at sort of 7 centimetres rather than 5 centimetres, would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there was a comment made to me not that long ago, and it was that people have got into the habit of rotationally grazing and hitting the residuals of the 4 centimetres to get the best persistency and the best utilisation from multi-species swards. They're going to have to accept that they're going to look untidy.
Yeah.
So they're going to go in at slightly higher covers and come out at higher covers, because the higher covers, you've still got more green material there. It allows those plants to photosynthesise and keep growing on. So hitting that 4 centimetre residual in a multi-species is going to be to the detriment of the persistency of the herbs within it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as long as you've got some means to tidy up maybe later on in the year, the animal performance will be good if they've got those herbs to continue growing on.
Yeah, I mean, the work that we talked about from Tommy Boland, he was showing that lamb weaning weight was about 2.3 I think kilos heavier than the lambs that were on just straight perennial ryegrass, and he was getting those lambs away quicker. So there is a massive place for these, not just from building resilience into our systems for drought resistance and these weather shocks, but also from animal performance as well. It's helping to lower the carbon footprint of that animal because you're getting them away quicker in the same way.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about sort of spreading the risk with diversity in the sward. What do you think works well, in terms of deep rooting species in pure stands? Do you ever think there's a value for that?
Here at Windshields, we've been looking at lucerne that's been growing this spring. As a bit of Joe's having a bit of a dabble and a bit of a trial with it. He's in the fortunate position that this is a very free draining farm. I would have liked his pH a wee bit higher, as I said earlier. So 6.8s to 7s, very difficult to get in Scotland, I know, and very free draining soils. They'll stand the slightly lower pH than 6.8, but they won't standing with their feet wet. They really struggle with that. So a pure stand of lucerne is a great way of producing that homegrown protein and having it on farm if you've got a farm that's capable of growing it. I think normally if somebody's thinking about growing something as a pure stand, rather than growing a pure stand of lucerne as a trial, I would say grow red clover. It's a slightly safer, easier option to grow and also manage to get homegrown protein on farm. The challenge if you're growing them as a pure stand and you want to be able to graze them is the fact that you've got these bloat risks, particularly with lucerne. When you're going to this real high protein, high quality feed, you've got to take the time to transition them, otherwise there's the risk of losing livestock, which nobody wants to do. And with red clovers, the risk is also the fertility issue we use at tupping time, so you've got to be very careful there. But again, I would say if you've got red clover, why have you got ewes on it at that time of year? If you've got lambs at home, that's the ones that should be the target stock for the red clover, because it's a fantastic crop for finishing lambs on. So it's about managing these different crops and not putting too big an area of them onto your farm, that you can then utilise them without limiting what you can do at other times of the year.
Yeah, of course. So you're alluding to like winter grazing being another issue as well. What else can we do to really to be on the negative side, to really fail at growing these crops, to make sure we don't get much out of them altogether? Winter grazing seems to be key. What other things can we do wrong?
Well, cutting height, particularly red clover that grows from a crown. If you don't leave 7-10 centimetres preferably, then you've the risk of the mower damaging the crown. If you damage the crown, persistency is gone. We've had examples where people have put in real high quality red clover lays and they've killed it in the first year because the contractor's come in, or the man in the mowers went in and hasn't set it correctly, and he's scalped it and he's damaged the crown of the red clover plant. So some of these other things they're fantastic crops, but it takes a wee bit of time to think about managing them to get the best out of them. And it's the same, like say a chicory plant's the same. To get persistency, never let it go to head, because it puts up a woody, very lignified seed head, and once that's broken, you've got a hollow stem like a straw that the rain can go straight down into the crown of the chicory plant, and you affect the persistency. So it's about managing these crops, and that's why I say don't put too much on, because then you have the flexibility to be able to go and graze them or cut them at the right stage, rather than having all your farm in it and then you're really in trouble after that. So it's having a small amount.
Yeah. It all adds to the theme. If you've got a small amount of bits and pieces, it helps improve resilience, because some species might thrive or some species might not survive so well. So good, thank you. So you see there's definite merit in considering these different species to complement your ryegrass and clover on the farm. But do consider your soils, do consider your local conditions and climate to understand whether these species are suitable for your farm. For more information, please see the Grazing for Profit and Biodiversity series on the Farm Advisory Service website.